Thank you. I'm on at the moment, the Menang and Pilbara Noongar people, and the other speakers are also joining us from their respective countries across Australia today. So I'm Andrea Gaynor. I'm a Professor of Environmental History at UWA, and I'm really delighted that I had such a good response from the invitees to this program. So we've got a panel of outstanding Australian environmental historians at various career stages, and I've asked them all to reflect upon the kind of status of our discipline, the risks and opportunities as we head rapidly into the mid-21st century. So we're here, obviously, as part of the European Society for Environmental History Today webinar series, and we're representing the Australasian region. Although you probably will have noted that the panel is about Australian environmental history and does not include Aotearoa, New Zealand. And this was really a deliberate decision, not because we don't like our colleagues across the Tasman, we very much do, but we wanted to schedule a session that would allow live participation from people in Europe, and to do so would have meant a really unsociable time for our colleagues across the Tasman. But we do hope to host a session on Aotearoa, New Zealand environmental history later this year, because there are certainly some differences to Australia. So do keep an eye out for that. So as far as the structure of today's roundtable goes, each speaker is going to provide a short perspective on Australian environmental history today, and I'll be introducing the speakers in turn before they say their piece. Then we will have a few questions and discussion between the panel members. Then we'll open up to the audience for questions. So if you do have a question for the panel, please keep a note of it. And if you can use the Zoom raise hand function, which is usually down the bottom under reactions, then I'll be able to take those questions in order. So Australian environmental history is now more than 50 years old, and in those decades has, of course, been shaped by the changing social, political and institutional context. And as I said, I've asked our panellists to take just one element of that context and of the changes or developments that they see in Australian environmental history in recent years and looking into the future. So yeah, we'll have a range of perspectives. To introduce our first speaker then, Jessica Urwin is a lecturer in environmental history at the University of Tasmania, and her research explores the complex relationships between radioactive mineral extraction, nuclear weapons testing, radioactive waste disposal, and colonialism. And her first monograph, Contaminated Country, Nuclear Colonialism and Aboriginal Resistance in Australia, will be published in the Weyerhaeuser Environmental Books series at the University of Washington Press in June. So congratulations on that, Jess. Take it away.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks everyone for being here. Before I begin, I would like to second what Andrew was saying and acknowledge that I'm zooming today from Nipaluna or Hobart on the unceded lands of the Moanina people, and I pay my respect to Moanina elders past and present and acknowledge the ongoing custodianship of Nipaluna's lands, waters and skies. And in the very short period of time I have to kick off this roundtable, and considering Australian environmental history today, I want to briefly consider the role of environmental justice in Australian environmental history. And I'll do so in reference to my own areas of expertise and interest, in particular resource extraction, with a specific focus on uranium. So I have a few slides just to help me guide my thinking. So I will quickly share those. And we made sure they worked, so hopefully everyone will be able to see these very soon. Great, so environmental justice is many things. It is a movement, a field of inquiry, and an analytical frame that seeks to shine a light on the injustices wrought by environmental racism, and has been engaged with by activists and scholars the world over for many decades. It has its origin in an African-American-led social movement during the 1980s, and over the last 3 decades, it has drawn attention to the unequal distribution of the benefits and costs of polluting or environmentally degrading industries, that, quote, threaten the fundamental right to clean air, land, water, and food by many peoples. But what I'm particularly interested in thinking about for the next 5 minutes is perhaps what the place of environmental justice is in Australian environmental history and vice versa. So how might Australian environmental history help the conversation too? And I see some opportunities. I'm not going to comment so much on risks, but opportunities perhaps. So the first opportunity I see in environmental justice scholarship is that it encourages Australian environmental historians to grapple with the relationship between environmental degradation and persistent settler colonial structures. So one of the key aims of the North American environmental justice movement is to adequately account for the factors underpinning social inequality. And these are factors that influence not only communities' connections to environments, but often enable and justify environmental degradation by states, companies, and so on. But more recently, and importantly for Australia, considerations of settler colonialism rather than just racism have entered the fold. In Australia and other settler colonies, for example, Canada, we are increasingly reckoning with the idea that environmental degradation is undoubtedly an issue of colonial injustice. And this is especially so in new histories of resource extraction, to which I'm trying to engage. Since Australia's invasion in 1788, settlers have utilised possessive logics to justify the usurpation of Aboriginal land, a process that involved violent land seizure and destruction and has been reliant largely on Indigenous erasure and invisibility. So I think what this offers us is a reminder that rather than being purely connected to socio-economic structures of inequality, Australian environmental history demonstrates that since the mining industry's sporadic and opportunistic beginnings in the 19th century, mineral extraction in Australia has relied upon, co-opted, and facilitated settler colonial forces. Environmental justice offers a lens through which to reckon with some of the difficult heritage of colonialism that continues to underpin resource extraction in Australia. Which brings me to my second opportunity that I see environmental justice bringing to Australian environmental history. So environmental justice, which is rooted itself in social movements, attempts to account for historical fights for justice, highlighting Indigenous agency. This focus on the positive and resilient relationships to environments that precede, persist, or coexist with environmental degradation is a vital opportunity for Australian environmental history, which is increasingly accounting for Indigenous agency, and to which Heather will no doubt speak, and I think is increasingly important in a time of crisis. No longer is the concept of environmental justice isolated to just thinking about the enactment of injustice, but there's been a vital shift towards recognising survival and memory as notable forms of justice and justice making in Australia. Recovery, resistance, and refusal constitute a plea for social and ecological justice for communities. So I think expanding one's scholarly remit to meaningfully include narratives of survival enacted through resistance, refusal, and resurgence, which are all words used by various scholars, especially in North America, facilitates more expansive discussion of Indigenous environmental justice, one that does not merely focus on the deleterious impacts of environmental injustice. And this has really important reciprocal conversations with the history of colonialism as well. So to conclude that very kind of swift 5-minute thought on environmental history in Australia, I think that considerations of environmental justice bring to Australian environmental history the opportunity to engage more deeply with settler colonialism's contribution to environmental degradation and the persistent enactment of dual environmental and social injustices, which are often kind of perpetuated in this time of crisis. But similarly, considered together, environmental justice and Australian history illuminate narratives of survival. Acknowledging this provides a richer understanding of Australian environmental history and its narratives of justice, memory, and survival over the past 200 or more years. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks very much, Jess. Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it, that we've tended not so much to use that environmental racism and environmental justice frame, partly, I think, because in Australia, we've tended to focus more on nature conservation and not so much the pollution kind of degradation that civil rights toxic kind of activism that led to environmental justice in the first place in the US. So yeah, that's some really interesting thoughts to reflect on. Thank you. So now on to Harrison Croft, who is a PhD candidate at the Monash Indigenous Studies Centre, Monash University, on unceded Boon Wurrung country. And his PhD thesis is exploring human, animal and plant relationships with Wirrarong, which is the Yarra River, with particular focus on how white settlement was complicated by the river's more than human networks in the 19th and 20th centuries. So Harrison is also interested in histories of climate change and protest, and he's published in History Australia. His forthcoming publications include an essay on a platypus in environmental history, can't wait to read that, and another on human, non-human encounters in Bass Strait with Palgrave Press. He's a postgraduate representative on the Australian Historical Association Executive Committee and with Monash University's Faculty of Arts Environmental Sustainability Working Group. Take it away, Harry.
Great, thanks so much, Andrea. I don't have any slides, but I will just get straight into it. For me, I'm coming to you from unceded Boonwurrung country, and it is approaching eel season here when the eels in the river begin their long migrations out to the Coral Sea under the spectre of the full moon. So I give thanks to country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Australia is the driest inhabited continent on Earth. It is also home to the oldest continuing culture on Earth. It should come as no surprise, therefore, that rivers and river networks loom large in Australia's historiography. They were important for Australia's first peoples and became sites of encounter when the first waves of newcomers began arriving much later. Even relatively recently, rivers' histories in the Capitolocene are entangled with settler colonial studies, urban history, and more than human histories. And given its island status, Australia is a particularly productive site of oceanic histories. But the centrality of river systems in the first peopling of the continent means that the blue humanities in Australia often take on a murky and brown characteristic, this being the colour of many of the rivers across the continent. So in this brief introductory sketch, I draw attention to the recent scholarship in that space, offering an Antipodean construction of the blue humanities that includes rivers and creeks as well as beaches and oceans. Emily O'Gorman and Andrea Gaynor's 2020 environmental history article consolidating more than human histories paved the way for O'Gorman's reanalysis of Australia's Murray-Darling Basin. The basin sees the tributaries of some of Australia's longest rivers and provides 1/3 of Australia's food supply. Its histories are long, entwined, and contested. And O'Gorman's attention to the more than human in her 2021 book, Wetlands in a Dry Land, revealed how human histories of various sites across the basin were in constant conversation with birds, plants, seals, and mosquitoes, to name a few. Drawing scholarly attention to murky, swampy, shadow places, O'Gorman draws environmental history into even closer conversation with environmental humanities. Katie Holmes at La Trobe University is leading the Parched Research Project, exploring histories of drought in the rural areas of the Australian state of Victoria. So drawing on oral histories and collaborating with historical climatologists and literary studies scholars, the project similarly underscores the importance of water on the continent and asks how drought shaped and was responded to by Victorians. At Monash University, Lynette Russell turns attention to the oceans that were sites of encounter between Australia's First Nations peoples and visitors in a history spanning 1,000 years. Surrounded by water, Australia is an especially fruitful site for refiguring ocean's place in environmental history, to look both ways across the beach, as Greg Denning invited. Her team's expertise spans history, linguistics, anthropology, and archaeology, and this multidisciplinarity lends itself well to the blue humanities. Australia's Great Barrier Reef probably needs no introduction here, but Rowan Lloyd's 2022 book draws attention to historical campaigns to protect it from harms from greedy corporations and their friends in government. Again, the blue humanities in Australia are at once liminal and broad, attending to coral reefs and billabongs, as well as oceans and rivers. And this dualism continues in Rowan Howitt's work, situated in the Southern Ocean. There, a vast, formidable, and lonely body of water is enlivened by penguins and icebergs, and offers analyses of exploration and exploitation, extraction and contraction, insofar as his penchant for global microhistory and the exceptional typical offer a zooming in and out, a rescaling invoked in Libby Robin's The Environment, A History of the Idea. Rowan's first book, based on his PhD, will be published with Melbourne University Press in May. Similarly scintillated by the South Seas, Sandro Antonello explores seagrasses thriving in intertidal environments and again refiguring the blue humanities. Through his focus on the intertidal, Sandro offers an urban blue humanities, exploring the relationship between coastal urban areas and their marine environments. Rivers loom large in Australian environmental history, and Heather Goodall got the ball to roll with her 2009 book Rivers and Resilience. But this was followed up with George's River Blues in 2022. Margaret Cook, Ian Hoskins, Ian Tyrrell, Grace Karskens, and many others have all lent their expertise to river history, and in most cases steer the blue humanities towards their brown turn, if I may. My own research is on Birrarung, or the Yarra River, flowing through the city of Melbourne. I explore the historical more than human relationships as they played out there, arguing that the settler colonial project was complicated by non-human agents. And Ruth Morgan's work on water is relentless. Her first book looked to the role of water in the arid state of Western Australia, ripe with potential comparisons between white settlement in Western Australia and the similarly dry Western USA. Ruth's engagement with water has redoubled following a brief meander to visit the question of climate internationalism in her latest book. She grapples with water in metropolises and water and imperialism, altogether to highlight its politics. Altogether, the blue humanities in Australia swell outward to include ephemeral wetlands and billabongs, turbid rivers and streams, and liminal coastal areas, as well as the beaches and oceans that girt the continent. Future work should continue to explore the edges of the discipline, the shadow places of Val Plumwood's work, and the uncharismatic species that inhabit these, like the microbes who filter out sewage and the shipworms who complicate our multi-species shipboard relationships. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Harrison. That's a really deft characterisation of a very broad and important segment of Australian environmental history. Well done. We turn now to Ruth Morgan, already mentioned. Ruth is an Associate Professor in the School of History and Director of the Centre for Environmental History at the Australian National University in Canberra. She is an environmental historian and historian of science with a particular focus on Australia, the British Empire, and the Indian Ocean world, living and working on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. She's concerned with questions of gender, climate, and water. And her most recent book, which is very recent, is Climate Change and International History, Negotiating Science, Global Change and Environmental Justice, which is published by Bloomsbury last year, 2024. Thanks, Ruth.
All right, thank you. Wonderful. Thank you for getting us together, Andrea, and thank you to all of you who have made time in your busy schedules to join us. As Andrea said, I'm joining you from beautiful Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present. So while I have dabbled in, well, perhaps more than dabbled, been relentless apparently with my interests in water, I suppose I've typically seen water as a manifestation or a way in which we can, as historians, grapple with questions of climate and climate variability. And from the Australian perspective, and I've put this rather busy map up on the screen to really demonstrate to our European friends just how variable Australian climates are. And you don't need to really look too closely except to notice that the colors change a lot. There's red, there's green, there's blue. And this is all showing just how from year to year, different parts of the country can swing between drought, flood, and all that happens in between. So basically no one year is the same, and that has posed enormous challenges historically to settler colonists who have tried to impose in different ways European models of economic production, usually agriculture, but of course other imports with them. Now, as you might understand, being the home to the world's longest continuous culture, this variability has been part of a way of life for Indigenous peoples in Australia since time immemorial. But the relationship or the sharing of knowledge between settler Australians and Indigenous peoples has not been so clear cut, but also it has only been relatively recent that historians have been able to start to excavate those encounters. And I think we have typically assumed that there was very little in the way of knowledge exchange there. But excitingly, historians like Harriet Mercer and Grace Karskens, among them, have begun to explore just what those encounters might have looked like, and really showing how, as historians, we ought to look a little bit more carefully and look to different sources and use different methods to try and draw out just what kinds of knowledge exchanges were possible, particularly in the colonial period. But going to this issue of variability, and I think this is, I suppose, the guiding principle for those of us that work on climate, is just how challenging this variability was in terms of adapting settler agriculture, settler ways of forming cities, and developing a particularly Australian way of life, as well as all the efforts to really mitigate that variability, whether it's constructing dams to prevent floods, to prevent the hardship of droughts and so on. And it points us not only to that annual variability, but to different temporalities more broadly. And so as I've mentioned, we've certainly engaged in different ways with slow and sudden disasters, but also seasons. So we've heard a little bit about Emily's work already, but I wanted to throw in her work on birds and the seasonal migrations that we are slowly becoming more attentive to in our histories when it comes to that seasonality of not only human Australians, but other creatures that live in Australian land and waters. And then I also think we're becoming more attentive to these longer time spans. And some of these influences have come from within Australian history. I'm thinking the work of Tom Griffiths, especially, but from outside as well, attending really to a rich vein of Indigenous history and bringing that work into conversation with understanding how oral cultures have passed down understandings of essentially changing sea levels that beyond, I suppose, the ordinary historical way of thinking. So we're starting to really think beyond, I suppose, the nation state or regional spatial scales, much broadly in terms of time as well. A couple of big developments, I suppose, or new aspects that we're seeing is not only a growing interest in the relationship between climate and health, which is not to say that there hasn't been a long tradition of understanding, I suppose, the intellectual history of climate, particularly around the tropics and white bodies, but increasingly to more medical and psychological concerns around perhaps climate and eco-anxiety, which Jamie Dunk, Andrea Gaynor, and others have been focusing on and developing further, as well as perhaps a very more modern project around the idea of how we relate to our very hot and sunny climate through skin cancer and other concerns around UV, which European friends might not realize how easy it is to get burnt in Australia. Finally, I want to also point to the exciting work happening around energy transitions. And this might not be an immediate thought when we think of climate, but really, I think there's some very exciting work being done around, I suppose, questions of culpability and accountability. When we look at the enormous role that mining has played in Australian history, Australian economics, we haven't explored coal mining, for instance, as much as we might. And so there's some really great work being done in that regard by the likes of Nancy Cushing, Liz Connor, Julie McIntyre, and that's why I've circled Newcastle on this very busy map, but to really bring out not only questions of labour, political economy, but also these broader questions of what these histories look like in an Australian context. So very briefly to map out some opportunities, I think there are huge opportunities for greater engagement with Indigenous knowledge holders, although of course not without ethical challenges around research partnerships. But I think the opportunities here with climate, with energy, with health, is that we are transcending the continent's boundaries. And I think this is work that has been what we've been aspiring to do for some time, but this is definitely one of the mechanisms or one of the avenues that we can pursue, whether that's engaging with the region or the globe or even, the planetary through Anthropocene thinking, and offering, I think, something of a Southern Hemisphere corrective to what are so often North Atlantic stories. There's also exciting opportunities for the more statistically and quantitatively minded with historical climatology, allowing for downscaling climate models, and again, bringing that Southern Hemisphere story into the current forecasting, and just drawing attention to the huge range of primary sources that we get to explore. As Harry mentioned with the Parch project, there's a lot more opportunities for us to engage with practitioners outside history when those opportunities arise in terms of art, literature, and so on. So I'm excited about climate history, and as you can see, these are just a small sample of the amazing amount of work that's been going on in this area for the last 15 or so years. So thank you, everyone.
Fantastic, Ruth. Thank you so much for that. You packed a lot in there, and I'm thinking there's lots of threads for us to pick up in later discussion around the Southern Hemisphere. A lot of people don't realise the Little Ice Age didn't happen down here. Practitioners outside history, mining and energy. Yeah, so many threads. But we will move on now to Tom Griffiths, who is Emeritus Professor of History at the Australian National University, and he is author of The Art of Time Travel, Historians and Their Craft, from 2016, Slicing the Silence, Voyaging to Antarctica, Forests of Ash, and Environmental History, and Hunters and Collectors, which I think demonstrates the range of Tom's interests in this broad area. And of particular interest to our European colleagues is his short epic on the history of Australia and the planet, Odyssey Down Under, which was published in Inside Story in 2023 and narrated on ABC Radio National's Science Show in 2023 and 2024. And it's probably still possible, is it, Tom, to find that online if you wanted to catch up with that. Oh, thank you very much, Sandro. There's the link there for you to follow on that short epic. So, Tom, if you could give us your perspective, please.
Thank you, Andrea, and hello, everyone. I'm speaking to you from Wurundjeri country. I'm on the southern flanks of an ancient extinct volcano, which is really the meeting place of Wurundjeri country and Djadjawurrung country and Tongarung country. It still is a sacred and special place. Where I'm speaking now was razed to the ground and exploded out of existence just over 40 years ago in the Ash Wednesday fires, which is probably an important place to speak to you about the matter that I want to raise in these opening minutes, because I would like to talk about fire. 5 years ago in Australia, we experienced what we call the Black Summer. Australians will remember, and Europeans may know, that plumes of smoke from those fires went around the globe. For 8 months across 2019 and 2020, Australia was overwhelmed by constant, terrifying firestorms from the middle of winter through to the start of the following autumn. The Black Summer unleashed its power on a continental scale, from Queensland to Western Australia, from Adelaide Hills to Victoria's East Gippsland, from Canberra to Tasmania. Everywhere, suddenly, bushfire was tipping into something new. And the fire was not just more extensive, intense, and enduring. It went rogue. Across New South Wales, there were 6 declared days of catastrophic fire danger, 22 days of extreme fire danger, and 72 of severe fire danger. There were 59 total fire ban declarations. Now, 19th century colonists, of course, quickly discovered that Australia was a land of fire, drought, and flooding plains, flooding rains, a land of climatic extremes. But what was this Black Summer? Great fires have traditionally been commemorated by Black Days, Black Friday, Black Thursday, Ash Wednesday, Black Sunday. But now they had turned into a Black Summer. About the time of the Black Summer, international fire historian Stephen Pine suggested a new historical category, the Pyrocene. He argued that as the planet heats up, Earth is now entering an age of fire. I think the Pyrocene is a more radical category than the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene declares the end of the Holocene, the most recent interglacial period. The Pyrocene goes further by declaring the end of the much longer and older Pleistocene, the whole epoch of ice ages. It announces the end of the age of ice, the beginning of the age of fire, and the end of what was truly the age of humans. After all, Homo sapiens are creatures of the ice ages. So the Pyrocene declares not the beginning of the age of humans, as is suggested by the name Anthropocene, but the end. And Australia is on the front line of the Pyrocene. So in writing about the Black Summer, we find ourselves describing something that was neither an event, nor was it just Australian. It was a planetary phenomenon. Fire is no longer a local or national story. Australia is the canary in the coal mine, certainly a coal mine, a belated warning of planetary peril. The world, I guess, is watching us. We are the burning frontier of a heating world, the perilous cliff edge of the 6th extinction. So for me, Australia's Black Summer brought home that environmental history is much more radical than it was imagined 50 years ago when it first developed as a self-conscious discipline. Then I think it was seen as grafting a 4th essential dimension of analysis onto historical practice. To race, gender, and class was added nature. Now we would argue, I think, that environmental history does much more than that. In its elucidation of the Anthropocene and the Pyrocene, it shatters the assumed separation between nature and culture, upon which I think the discipline of history was founded. Environmental history, if taken seriously, undoes the Western philosophy of historical practice. Perhaps that explains why many of our colleagues continue to keep it at arm's length in their work. Fire is also a category of experience that in Australia takes us to the heart of Indigenous culture. Fire is at the very core of Aboriginal civilization, as it is of the nature of Australia. Aboriginal peoples cooked, cleansed, farmed, fought, and celebrated with fire. The greatest revolution in Australian historical sensibility in our lifetimes, I think, has been in understanding the depth and complexity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures. The recognised length of Australian human history increased tenfold in 5 decades, from a few thousand years to over 65,000 years. What other continent, what other nation has experienced that dizzying and exhilarating escalation in historical human time? We're still coming to terms with it. It's not just about time depth. Australians are also awakening to the realisation that what colonists thought was nature was actually culture, that every facet and feature of the land and its creatures was shaped and curated by humans over millennia. Indigenous history is environmental history, and environmental history is Indigenous history. We are experiencing, I think, an exponential expansion in the field of our inquiries. How do we write histories where the land and its creator beings come first, remaining vividly alive even after colonisation, just as the sovereignty of First Peoples was never ceded and endures today? In Australia, this is the direction that environmental history is taking us, towards a respectful partnership with Indigenous peoples on their own countries and towards giving agency to more than human histories. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tom. What an outstanding survey. Again, you've taken us on a really long journey in a really compressed period, which is fantastic. And again, more threads for us to pick up on in our discussion. But first, we turn to our last speaker, Heather Goodall, who is Professor Emerita at the University of Technology, Sydney. She's a historian who first researched with Indigenous people on land issues in Aboriginal politics, which was published as From Invasion to Embassy in 1996. Wow, was that really that long ago? It still seems like such an important work. She later researched for the Pitjantjatjara Council in Central Australia for their case to the Royal Commission into British Nuclear Testing about the testing and severe impacts on First Nations people and their lands of that nuclear testing program. Heather has worked with Indian colleagues on comparative and gendered histories, and she's researched collaboratively with Tranby Aboriginal Adult Education Cooperative. So you get the picture. She's a very collaborative, engaged kind of historian. She's published on cultural and environmental relationships in rural and urban areas, including in southwestern Sydney, with Indigenous Australians, Arabic speakers, Vietnamese Australian and Anglo-Irish residents along Sydney's Georges River. Back to rivers. Heather continues researching in southwestern Sydney with community activists defending wetlands.
Right. Well, I've actually got 3 themes that I want to talk about, but I'll try and do it very briefly, and then we can pick it up in discussion. The first theme is about First Nations people, and I think it is incredibly important. I follow on from what all of the previous speakers have said about the importance of recognising deep time and that incredible depth of culture and the generation of landscape and land and in the more than human world in Australia. But one of the things that I think is of concern is that the focus has been on the pre-colonial cultures and engagements of First Nations peoples rather than on contemporary situations where the impact of colonialism has been such that First Nations people have been moved and have moved themselves across the country from place to place, looking for work, escaping racism, looking for education, and looking to build a way of engaging with the future. Now, one of the things that has been really important, I think, is that there is work emerging in environmental history, which is building on partnerships with First Nations people in the present. And those people may not be the people who have ancestral connections to any one place. they might well be people who have come from many other places and who are building relationships because they've taken responsibility for country. And I think that recognition is really important. There's a number of First Nations historians who are working in environment. Heidi Norman is one, a director of Indigenous Land and Justice Research Group at the University of New South Wales. She's worked on land and meanings in her work on the Land Rights Act and is looking at contemporary First Nations communities' involvement with renewable energy and responses to climate change. So it's an important area in which environmental history has been drawn into the partnerships that Tom has just talked about. And I think these are partnerships with people who have built their sense of responsibility from their deep involvement, their deep background in First Nations culture, but who are not necessarily living on the land of their ancestors because of colonialism. And I think that engagement and that partnership has been really important. Now, another work is the work that Grace Karskens has been involved in People of the River. One of the things she uncovered was that list of names in Indigenous languages of the places along the Hawkesbury-Nepean River. And rather than working on that herself, she engaged with First Nations people in the area. So Leanne Mulgo Watson, sorry, and Erin Wilkins, Jasmine Seymour, Rhiannon Wright, and Cindy Laws, they're all names that we need to know. They worked with Grace and they've developed a really interesting website. Grace's book is called People of the River. The website, which is up on, I know I haven't actually got the link, maybe Sandra. It's up on the State Library, I think, and it's called The Real Secret River. And all of them have been involved in doing this. They researched those names. They explored a whole lot of Indigenous languages, which allowed them to look at the ways people, even in those early periods, had been moving around in order to try and engage with the changed circumstances that they faced. This is a really important collaboration, and it brings First Nations people today into engagement with environmental historians and with history itself as they explore their relationship to responsibility in the present. Another example is Emily O'Gorman's work with Danielle Carney-Flakelaar. And we've already heard a lot about Emily's work, but this is the collaboration with Danielle around the Macquarie Marshes in particular. Danielle works with National Parks and Wildlife, and one of the outcomes of this collaboration has been continuing work and the foregrounding of Danielle's a sustained valuing and use of and work with weaving traditional First Nations women's culture. In the Macquarie Marshes, the reeds which are generated in that marsh area are used for the weaving that Danielle does, that she's able to share with other First Nations women in the area and across the country. And both she and Emily have talked about the process of weaving as being part of the way we understand country. And I think Emily's to be enormously commended in taking that on. And Danielle has been incredibly generous in sharing both her skills and her knowledge about country and place and the ways in which First Nations women are working together. Now, I wanted to talk briefly about interdisciplinarity because I think that's incredibly important. We are thinking about environmental history tonight, and many of us have been trained in history, but it is important that we no longer see ourselves as an isolated discipline, an isolated profession, that we look to what we can learn from people, not only First Nations people, but people who have been trained in a range of different disciplines. And I mean, certainly in the work that I was able to do with historian Jodie Frawley, but with aquatic biologist Scott Nichols and Liz Baker, who works with National Parks and Wildlife, an ecologist. I learned an enormous amount about the ways in which fishing generates ideas and memories, but also about the body of knowledge that Scott and Liz had about rivers and aquatic environments. We all valued, I think, we all learnt from each other. We shared each other's work. We were taught by each other. And it was an enormous advantage, I think, to be able to work with people from other disciplines. Another example is a project that I'm around the edges of at the moment, which is with Ilaria Vani Akarigi and Alexandra Crosby, both of whom work in design. They're people who have considered the ways in which visual design and visual representation can allow us to engage more actively with what they call civic ecologies, with the way the people in the area they're working in is the area of the Cooks River. And it's an area called Green Square, which was a heavy industrial area in Sydney and which is being rapidly reinvented and redesigned as an environment for large numbers of people to live in apartments. And it's very much a human-created urban design, but there is all sorts of ways in which the watercourse of the Cooks River, which has been undergrounded, is being revitalised and revived, partly by this project and partly by everyday people in that area. And one of the things that Ilaria and Alex have been able to do is to show this through photography, images and designs which allow that to be seen and talked about. So another geographer that I've had the great delight of being involved with has been Taylor Coyne, who's working also with undergrounded water in the areas a little bit further to the east towards the coast in Sydney. And he's also looking to creative, what's normally regarded as artistic and creative work, to think about sonic and augmented reality experiences with the undergrounded water that's been turned into canals and drains underground and channels in these areas of eastern Sydney. And I think the great opportunity that we have as environmental historians is to draw from our colleagues in a range of these areas like visual design and sonic work, as well as in geography, who can open up these creative ways to not only communicate, but to build collaborations. The work of Deborah Bird Rose, the late Deborah Bird Rose, has been really important as an ethnographer, and working with Tom Van Doren, who's a philosopher, has been important for me. I've learned from both of them, and I value, again, that capacity to work across disciplines, to be able to learn from what people bring. Now, just very quickly, I want to talk about transnationalism. Have I got time to do that, Andrea? Really fast.
Quickly.
Okay. I particularly want to talk about the work I've been around with the geographer Haripriya Rangan, and the incredibly interesting work she's been able to generate about environments. She calls it environmental history. She comes out of a geography background and she draws all those skills together. She's worked on Acacia farnesiana, is one of the areas she's worked on. That's Australians will know wattles as a national flower and something we identify very strongly with, but of course acacias are also endemic in Southern Africa. And one of the things that Haripriya has looked at is the way a particular Acacia farnesiana, came to Australia prior to British settlement, British invasion. And it's regarded as a pest, as the thorny wattle, but in fact, it's a part of this extensive acacia network across the Indian Ocean. It's actually bringing the Indian Ocean into focus. in order to traverse the north-south Australian deserts in Central Australia, British settlers imported camels from northwest India and Afghanistan, and they imported handlers whom they called Afghans, many of them northwestern Indians, but people from that general area. Now, Acacia farnesiana goes really well through camel gut. Camels love Acacia farnesiana. They eat it and the seeds come out in their droppings. And so you ended up with Acacia farnesiana all the way up Central Australia with the camels. And the outcome of that has been that both the Acacia farnesiana and the camels were drawn into First Nations cultures and stories and narratives along the way. And there were intermarriages, interrelationships between the Afghani handlers and the First Nations women whom they encountered. And so there is all sorts of new engagements which have emerged out of that Acacia farnesiana. Another area that Haripriya Rangan has worked on has been baobabs, boabs, we call them in Australia. And there, Haripriya, a geographer, has worked not only with other geographers and archaeologists, but with geneticists. And she's drawn samples, genetic samples from baobab trees in Africa, which is their area of origin, and India in Gujarat, where she knew there was a large set of concentrations, and the Kimberleys in Australia. And she's worked with First Nations people and archaeologists and geneticists, as I've said. There was new knowledge that emerged from those collaborations for each of those sites. And about Australia, and I'll finish on this, about Australia, what was generated by this genetic exploration was that the baobabs, the boab trees, moved very rapidly with the end of the last ice age, the rising of the sea level and the covering of the northwest shelf. The people who were there moved into the drier areas. They took boab seeds with them, and they then the boabs were spread very rapidly across that whole Kimberley region. But there was no genetic diversity. There wasn't time, which means that they must have been moved by people. So it's a new way to think about First Nations people. These are people who've often been denigrated as hunters and gatherers who didn't manage the environment. This is yet another demonstration that First Nations people were drawing on non-cultivated plants and utilising them, moving them around, managing the landscape with their own survival, as well as, and now these boab trees have changed the Australian landscape. They're a major feature of that northwestern country. And so we learn an enormous amount from this collaboration between geographers, geneticists, and historians. So I'll finish there. There's lots more to say. There's so many wonderful innovations and opportunities which have been taken, not only by the people who've spoken already, but by the people they've spoken about, and lots of others we haven't mentioned. So hopefully there'll be lots more ideas come up in the discussion. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Heather. I'm thinking that one of the key threads or kind of commonalities or issues that emerged out of several talks there was that of partnerships and collaborations. So partnerships with Indigenous people, partnerships and collaborations with researchers in other disciplines. And I'm wondering if you think that this is a major opportunity for environmental history, or a kind of strategic direction in which environmental history is moving at this point. I think it's probably fair to say that environmental history started out as a fairly individual pursuit. When I'm thinking about early works of environmental history, they tended to be written by single historians. And I'm thinking increasingly we are having partnerships, collaborations, and that's one way in which environmental history is changing. But is it kind of diluting the discipline in a way? Are there risks or disadvantages to collaborations and partnerships as well, if I can be devil's advocate there. Would anyone like to speak to that?
I'll say something.
Go on, jump in, Tom.
A lot of my work's been in the field of public history. I think that's still a very useful term. I know a lot of environmental historians are public historians, which means that they are in partnership from the very beginning. Really, their work grows out of conversations in communities and carries right through to the end of their work. And I think that's an enormous strength of history as a whole, and a special strength of environmental history because, it's feet on the ground, it's out there talking, looking at places, being with people in country that's going to involve you in very rewarding partnerships. So I've found partnerships with the community to be something where I'm amongst equals. I'm learning as much as I'm teaching. Really, I think the great advantage of historians is we expect to listen. I think we expect to listen. We're looking for voices. We're wary about silences. We want to investigate them too. We're not there to lecture, really. We're much more often, I think, there to listen and learn. And that's a humble thing about most history. And I think environmental historians are of that ilk. However, I've also advocated, just as Heather has, for interdisciplinary work with scientists and policy wonks and so forth. And I think that's very important. And I'm absolutely committed to it. But in a reflective forum such as this, I'm inclined to reflect that I've learned a lot from scientists. I think they've learned a lot less from me. That may be a reflection on me, but I think it's probably a reflection on the status of history in the kind of public sphere. I haven't learned a great deal from managers, but they've certainly not listened to me much in terms of fire. For example, I've been, I think, with others, developed a very strong critique of the poverty of historical scholarship in management work, in fire management work. These are policy experts who think they can do history, and they produce bad history. And bad history, tragically, can lead to suffering and death. And certainly it's led to it led to a very bad policy that resulted in many more deaths than should have occurred in the Black Saturday fires. And I've tried in my writing and speaking to link that to a lack of history in the management work. But, managers as a whole have really run away from that kind of finding. It's uncomfortable. They don't want to hear it. And history's, it doesn't, our civic expertise is not sufficiently respected in the public realm. And that's something about our public culture. But it doesn't stop us from doing our good work. And a lot of people do listen to us because we're in conversation with them. And I think in terms of my partnerships with local communities have been enormously rewarding. But as I say, I would just also put that note of warning that scientists, they love to cherry pick history, but they don't really do history and they don't easily learn from historians. And managers really don't like history.
Wow, there you go. There's a provocation, but you're absolutely right. I think I did mischaracterise Australian environmental history. When you think about it, someone might have their name on a book, but it doesn't mean that they're writing in and of themselves. A lot of that writing has come from conversations and partnerships, even if it's impractical to have joint authorship on all of these works. And yes, I think perhaps what you've signalled there is a need to attend to the nature of the partnerships and how unequal they might be. And there's lots of different kinds of inequalities in partnerships and ways of listening. Did anyone else want to speak to the topic of partnerships? Heather.
Yeah, I think I totally agree with Tom that the what we can learn from history and how we see the well, we could call it path dependency if we wanted to pick up on the systems thinking that's much more commonly used among scientists, perhaps. But if we could think about the ways in which the historical situations have directed us to particular pathways or suggested opportunities, then certainly there needs to be a greater recognition of what we might learn. I would think that the way to do that is to be actively involved in partnerships, to be involved in the team strategies for historical work, which are increasingly being done. If you look at, some of us might be in a position to lead projects, but many of us are in a position to take part in collaborative projects. And I think that's an essential thing that we should be doing. So whether we're working with geographers or linguists or geneticists, the opportunities to collaborate, as well as with communities, First Nations people, are things we should take up. That's all.
How about our early career researchers? Do you find that there are opportunities for partnerships that you can readily take up, or are there some barriers to people in your position?
I have worked in partnerships of the kind of various descriptions that both Tom and Heather have touched on, and I think there are different types of partnership. I worked in collaboration with a number of Indigenous people for my PhD, and that was a very different partnership to working for a government organisation as an oral historian, but essentially as a consultant. And there were very different approaches. I do think resource-wise, it is very difficult to build meaningful partnerships in PhD programs now. The kind of necessary slow research that is required of really powerful and community-led PhDs that are not really achievable in a 3.5-year period. I was incredibly lucky that I got to speak to, a dozen people, but that was only a dozen and could have been dozens more. And then I suppose there is the increased opportunity in that a lot of ECR positions, of the few that are available, may be in partnership with others as research assistants on larger projects, as consultants within government and others. So I think it's interesting thinking as an ECR about partnership with others. I have been very lucky to have lots of great opportunities, but perhaps not always reaching the end goal that you would have liked. For example, working in such a way that oral history and our historical practice is really valued by people, but not necessarily the end results that you come up with is not necessarily what people want to hear. They want you to be able to interview people, but they don't love the answers they're getting because they don't align with whatever kind of policy outcome they're hoping to create. So that was a bit of a garbled answer to your question, but perhaps a little bit of a reflection on various types of partnership.
No, that was good. That was really insightful. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? We had a forum at an Australian Historical Association conference 20 years ago now, unbelievably, at which we posed the question, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, can environmental history change the world? And Steve Mullins, a Queensland-based environmental historian who had been working with scientists, basically complained that that historians were used as science communicators. Thanks, Andrea. That's a link to the article, I presume. And it strikes me that perhaps that is still a bit of an issue there in terms of scientists really taking on board what it is that we do. Part of the problem, I suspect, is that history is sort of stubbornly contextual. It's stubbornly particular. It is dedicated to the context and to nuance and complexity. And policymakers in particular, but also to an extent scientists, I think they want simplicity, they want reduction, they want generalisation. And that's something that the people who come from scientific disciplines like Jared Diamond and who like to try and do scientific history produce, but those of us who have come from a historical tradition resist that because it's part of what our discipline is about. But do you think that we should be attempting to meet policymakers on their terms and to offer some kind of more digestible, dare I say, reductive history? Or should we stick to our guns? Should we keep occupying the ground of complexity and contingency in the face of, what are obviously very real and pressing problems that policymakers want answers to? How do we bridge that divide? How do we make history useful or environmental history useful whilst maintaining the sense of complexity and nuance that is at its core? Just a little question there. Heather again.
Yeah, look, I just mentioned that we had a in the Talking Fish project where we were working with Scott Nichols and Liz Baker, we attempted to address that problem by having panels. We were producing books which were being circulated among fishers in the various reaches of the rivers we were working in, and we had panels. A panel where historians like Jodie and myself would craft our historian's response to a particular issue or question, and the panel where Scott and Liz would craft theirs, but they were both equivalent. They were both part of the production. And so thinking about different perspectives and the way we can look at things perhaps differently, but nevertheless come together and both offer valuable insights into a problem might be something to be at least considered.
Yeah, terrific. Yeah, that offers one potentially useful model. Thanks, Heather. Did anyone else want to comment on that, Tom?
To respond to your question, Andrea, about should historians engage with the policy people on their terms? Yes, absolutely. As well as drawing them onto our ground, because history can offer very practical solutions, and it often does. I mean, I could give many examples from the area of fire where history is a survival guide. It's very clear, it's useful, no question. Or look at Margaret Cook's wonderful work on the river with a city problem and how much work she's done in the media in terms of trying to turn around a whole paradigm of management with good history. And I think there are many of us in the environmental history field who are doing that work. And I didn't want my reflection to be depressing. I wanted it to be realistic and motivating in a way. I think we can change minds, we can change policy, we do. But we have to always come from behind. We don't begin with it on a plate. And a lot of disciplines do. Economics, for example, it's expected to deliver, and it generally doesn't. And history is, as you say, it's so local and contextual, and it's labour intensive. It takes time. It doesn't necessarily take a lot of money, but it takes a lot of time, and it's hard work. I think it's something I'm really proud about with our discipline, and those virtues are not apparent to others easily, partly because we're good communicators and we tend to be like, hiding the hard work to some extent and telling the story as a powerful parable, and it's not apparent just how much work has gone into that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. If we change tack just a little bit, Harrison, you mentioned the blue humanities, and I was wondering if you might reflect a little on what you see as the relationship between the environmental humanities more broadly and environmental history. Is this a relationship of sort of opportunity, or are there risks there?
A great question, and one maybe you are better suited to answer than me. I think I came to the environmental humanities relatively late in my project, and so I'm still learning where its disciplinary boundaries end and where the most fruitful collaborations can be. But I think the way in which it's developed in Australia has lent itself particularly well to collaborations within environmental history, as your and Emily's paper shows. And so I think in terms of future work to be done there, I hope that that will continue to be cross-disciplinary, and I'm thinking about eco-poetics and ecofeminism in particular, and queer ecologies as other sort of similarly situated kinds of scholarship. In terms of if there are risks, I am an inherent optimist, and so I don't know if I can be drawn to comment on that.
No, that's completely okay. Did anyone else want to comment on the relationship between environmental history and environmental humanities? No, we're all going to stick in the history corner while reaching out across the divide. Yeah, well, it's confusing, isn't it? Because environmental humanities is both an emerging subdiscipline or emerging discipline in its own right, and a kind of broad umbrella that we all exist under in the neoliberal institutions that we are part of, in a way. So I think that I often wear two hats. I'm a historian, probably first and foremost, but I do branch out into environmental humanities, as well as reaching out in a range of other ways. And in fact, engagement with environmental humanities, I think, enlivens my work and certainly my teaching, because I now teach in that area rather than environmental history to the extent that I teach. I can see that there's... Oh, Tom.
A quick plug for the Australian version of that term, which is the ecological humanities. And Heather mentioned Deborah Birdrose's wonderful work, which the more I read Debbie's work, who was just a greatly esteemed colleague, the more I realise how far ahead of her time she was. And it's well worth revisiting her work just for the joy of it, as well as what we learned from it. But yes, she, together with a group of us, we were championing, before environmental humanities became a term, Australians were arguing for the ecological humanities. And because I think the word ecology has an extra edge, and it has a particularly Australian edge because we live in a continent with such a confrontingly different ecology, and it's changed who we are. It makes the people here in a very different way. You know, it's influenced us all. It's deeply in the culture of the place. And so the ecological humanities, I feel, puts right up front the interface with science that environmental history aspires towards, and I think it connects it to the ecological revolution, which I think is what's unfolded since the 1960s in terms of ecological consciousness. I think it's a much more exciting term than the environmental humanities, but I do understand why we've used that term. It's as often the case, we have to bow to the rest of the world and enter into their debate and try and turn it southwards.
I like that idea, turning it southwards. And yes, I think you're absolutely right. I feel like it's challenging enough to make environmental humanities legible without casting out on our own at this time. And there seem too many urgent tasks to argue the toss about how it's labelled in Australia. But yeah, I think you do have a good point, and it is worth noting that there was that ecological humanities section of Australian Humanities Review, for example, where a lot of really important groundbreaking work was published. And that was very early on and very interdisciplinary in orientation and tackling the kind of big questions that environmental and seeking new methods that environmental humanities, broadly conceived, is trying to adopt. But Yes, and turning southwards. So Ruth mentioned the southern hemisphere. Do you think that Australian environmental history is still very distinctive? I'm sure that Tom, you would argue that it is, or do you think it's been sort of massaged into a kind of internationalist mould by the dominance of the environmental history coming out of, or maybe not the dominance, maybe just the proliferation of the environmental history that comes out of the American scene in particular, but also Europe. We're outweighed. We're a relatively small community of environmental historians in Australia, perhaps not relative to our population size, but we are only one, modestly sized country here. What's your feeling on that? Does it still maintain a distinctive character? Obviously, we're talking about distinctive environments, but is the character of the history we write distinctive? And how would you describe that to an international audience?
Is that something that I shall kick off?
Go for it, Ruth.
Okay, I will do my best. Yeah, I suppose I think there's I think when you do float around to the different parts of the world with their environmental history meetings, I mean, I've often been struck by the slight differences along the way. And while we all sit under the very big tent of environmental history, I've tended to notice sometimes a more quantitative streak, sometimes among the Europeans, a much more, I suppose, North American flavor with the manifest destiny floating underneath some of the narratives that come from there. I think we definitely see very different narratives coming out of the Africanist and Latin American scholarship, really drawing on important political ecology, political economy ideas there, understandably. I think in Australia, we're a bit of a hybrid beast, really. Not least because we have our own origin stories, although we share some of those with other countries. Perhaps sort of a fusion of even European and North American histories, the influence of forest history and historical geography. But I think we do it our own way, and I think we wrestle a lot with our sort of nation for a continent, continent for a nation, as Libby Robin's written. That's a very unique position to be in, and to write about our own histories. And if we don't do it, no one else is going to do it. So while I think we do often ride some of those international waves, we are doing it in our own way. Not least because many of us have well, our audiences are often Australian and our funders are often the government. And so we are very much attuned to the local, but saying, well, how do these global trends look when we are looking at them from our part of the world? Which isn't to say that we are insular or parochial. I think we're just used to, as people living in Australia, of being aware of where we're at in a global knowledge economy, really.
Yeah, very, very good points. I wonder if, in a way, we're probably most similar to Canadian environmental historians and have
I see
in common with them.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I build on what Ruth was saying? I'm glad you brought out Canada, because I think hopefully what came across in the 5 minutes I spoke is I think that Australian environmental history has a lot to teach other kind of geographies of environmental history. In particular, my work has been talking into North America because my book is being published in the US, and I had someone at the American Society of Environmental History meeting actually say to me, I've never even thought of Australia until you just mentioned it. And I think there is something to be said of trying to insert Australia into these conversations as providing perhaps a way of expanding the conversation. And I'm really interested in what you mentioned earlier, Andrea, about this idea that environmental justice hasn't really been taken up by Australian environmental historians in the same way it has as North American environmental historians. But I think at the same time, North American environmental justice scholars are only just scratching the surface of thinking about colonialism, irrespective of the deep colonial history of the North American continent and surrounds, regardless of an engagement with it directly. And so by virtue of dealing with socioeconomic issues and marginalized communities within cities, for example, there's a complete inability to kind of encapsulate Native American experiences or others in that story. And I think Canada Canadian environmental history has necessarily had to grapple with its settler colonial past in the same way that Australian historians have had to grapple with the settler colonial past and the way that they're entwined. So I do think that by virtue of entering countries like Australia into these conversations, we're perhaps in a position to expand conversations about colonialism. I mean, if that's the one thing I can offer in my career, is this hope that others might think a bit more about the nuances of colonialism in geographies where it's not necessarily front of mind. Because there are geographies like Australia, Canada, and I would argue North America, where it's integral to the environmental histories that are told, especially if we're thinking about injustice, but also increasingly as we're thinking about how people have responded to environmental injustice or degradation, how communities are responding is often by critiquing structures and systems. And in a lot of these states, colonialism is one of the kind of dominant structures that continues to bear down. So yes, I would like to think Australia has kind of a unique environmental history discipline, but also one that offers a lot to others, regardless of whether they've thought about Australia before.
That was a terrific response, Jess. Thanks so much. It brought to mind for me Thomas Dunlap's very impressive book on nature and the English diaspora, which of course was an impressively sort of transnational comparative history across Australia, Canada, the UK, and the US. I don't know if you could really attempt that now. The proliferate, there's so much scholarship. Wow, we're just about to finish up. We haven't even taken questions from the floor. Is there anybody listening in, tuned in, who would like to ask our panel a question? Now's your chance. Nancy.
I would ask a question. Thank you so much, everyone. It's wonderful sitting here in my little flat listening to all of you, just like we were all at a conference together. It's beautiful. Just thinking about that idea of how is Australian environmental history distinctive. One of the things that sort of took me by surprise when I realized that it was a thing in the United States is that there's kind of an outdoorsy blokishness about environmental history, which, as I say, I didn't know. But here, you know, growing up in Australian environmental history, I have found it to be very almost perhaps female dominated. So I was really surprised at that sort of differently gendered approach in the United States. And I wonder if anyone would comment on that. How did Australia, a notoriously masculinist society, come to this position? Or alternatively, why is it different in other places?
That is a very good question, Nancy. I think, well, does anyone else want to jump in?
Only to agree with you, Nancy.
And I mean, the origins of Australian environmental history and forest history kind of was pushing it in that direction, perhaps, but it didn't seem to work as it became a bigger and more differentiated field. You know, women have really climbed to be many of the leaders in the field, I would argue, and I hope that it feels welcoming to everyone.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think it started off as a male-dominated area, but yeah, it probably fairly rapidly did become quite female dominated. Now we think about it, and yeah, certainly I think has been very inclusive, particularly with regard to gender. I think it would love to be more inclusive with regard to other kinds of diversity. But as we all know, there aren't as many Indigenous scholars as we would like for kind of legacy reasons. There are those people coming forward, and we're trying to support them, I think, as best we can. But how to explain that transformation? Well, it's possibly because of the leadership of people like Heather and like Grace Karskens and Libby Robin, who got out there and demonstrated that this was a field in which women could excel.
Yeah, and I'm happy to accept that.
I would add also that history in general in Australia, I think it has had a very strong tradition of feminist historians who have reached the very highest sort of pinnacle of the discipline. So yeah, it is interesting. I just don't think we have some of those challenges of some of the problems that I know colleagues in the United States face around the sorts of topics that are welcomed and the sorts of people who reach the top of the field. So yeah, but as you say, the leaders in our own area have been so important to setting that example and bringing up junior scholars of all stripes.
And I should say, I think there's also been good institutional support, certainly in the past, from our universities. I fear that internationally that might be changing, but our universities, at least in my experience, have had very good policies for supporting female and diverse scholars. Now, I'm just looking, there's somebody, Lillian, oops, I've lost stuff here, put something in the chat. What was there? The Roots of Ecological Humanities in Australia with Debbie Bird Rose, Val Plumwood, Freya Matthews and others too. Indeed, yes. Yeah, so I guess it's not just history then, but in environmental history adjacent type areas. Yeah. Heather.
Yeah, look, I mean, I absolutely agree with many of the points that have just been made, but I just wanted to raise, just in the last few minutes we've got. Yesterday, I was with a group of, well, they're now first-year university students mostly, but they were high-performing matriculation students. They were getting prizes for the history essays that they wrote. The History Teachers Association had sponsored these prizes. And I was listening to the topics of the essays that these students had done, and none of them were environmental. And I talked to some of the teachers afterwards, and a number of them said, I'd given a little keynote, and a number of them said, oh, I didn't really think about environment as being part of history. And I think one of the things we need to be thinking, given that, young people are so incredibly concerned about climate change in the future, as we know, I think we need to be thinking a lot about the ways we access the educational sphere, young people, teachers, the way we're thinking about the way that the work we do is communicated to young people, and so that the questions that we might have about the future align with theirs, and they can see a value in working with the sorts of evidence that we're drawing on.
That is a really good point, Heather. I know that in Victoria, the upper school curriculum includes environmental history. There was, actually, where did I see it? Recently, there was a social studies textbook used in Western Australia that included an error that I had to try and correct. So I know that there's some kind of environmental history in there, although that wasn't identified as such. But certainly I've been to the local high school and given talks in the geography classes and the history classes, and that's, a form of engagement that I find quite fulfilling. But, there's only so much time that we all have. It's a very good point, though, about the coming generations and how we explain environmental history and what it is and its potential. I think that's a really important role. So on that note, it is now 6 o'clock here. Sorry, we've got a few more things in the chat. Oh, yes. So Sandro has said, remember that you can follow environmental history news from Australia and Aotearoa New Zealand through our Environmental History Network. So do check out the website if you're interested in finding out more about what's going on down under. Jess says that she was asked by a colleague on how one writes a history of the environment. So yeah, perhaps there is still a lack of awareness out there on environmental history and its significance. Thank you all for coming along and listening to our various talks. I'd like to very much thank our participants for their perspectives and for giving so freely of their time for this discussion. I've really learned something here today and I hope you have too.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, everyone.